What you call that noise?
The XTC Podcast.
What do you call that noise?
Hello and welcome to What Do You Call That Noise, the official XTC podcast. My name's Kev Windsor, and I've been an XTC fan since the age of 15. I think if anybody knew me around the ages of 15 to 20 or so would know that I was just a little bit obsessed with the boys from Swindon. I dressed like them. I played in a band that covered songs by them. I wrote songs by them. Yes, I'm sorry, I ripped off a few things. Sorry, Mr. Partridge. And I thought I was, metaphorically, first in the queue to get a copy of White Music. I say metaphorically because I lived near a small market town called Holsworthy in Devon. And we couldn't actually buy it there. I had to order it. And I think it took a couple of weeks to come through. You know, it was a kind of a case of, we don't get much call for XTC round here, young Mr. Windsor. Yeah, I had the copy with the faint white titling as well. Yeah, I thought I was very proud of that. I also got to see them twice. Quite lucky, I realise. Once at Plymouth Polytechnic in December 1979, and again at the Oxford New Theatre in October 1980. That was on the Black Sea Tour. So it's a thrill and somewhat of a surprise that 40 years later, I've been asked to grab the reins of the official XTC podcast and talk to three writers who have put XTC in print. The 15-year-old me is freaking out a little. So with me today are Chris Twomey, author of Chalkhills and Children, the definitive biography of the band; Todd Bernhardt, co-author with Andy Partridge of Complicated Game, Inside the Stories of XTC; and Mark Fisher, editor of Limelight, the 1980s fanzine, to whom I wrote to about 37 years ago. And we've only just made contact again in the last couple of months. How lovely is that? He also wrote the XTC bumper book of fun for boys and girls and What Do You Call That Noise, an XTC Discovery Book. We'll be hearing from them in a moment. But first, a big thank you to the generous supporters on Patreon, who include Pink Things, Humble Daisies, and Knights in Shining Karma, who make this podcast possible. The Knights in Shining Karma will get a name check towards the end of this episode. But right now, I'd like to give a shout out to one of them, Simon Slateholm, who many years ago was responsible for The Bungalow, a pioneering XTC website, sadly no more. These days, Simon devotes his spare time to running a craft ale bar in the village of New Biggin by the Sea on the northeast coast of England. It's called the Ink Spot, and you can read all about it and his 6 taps of draft craft ales at www.theinkspot40.co.uk. But first, a quick visit to the playground, and we're off to Germany, where we find Arthur and Esther, children of Rainer Fielder, talking about their favourite XTC songs. We'd also like to give a big thank you to Polly, Hamish, and their dad Don for letting us hear it in English. Thanks to Jessica at Strange Town Theatre in Edinburgh for making that happen. We start with Rainer asking Esther about Battery Brides.
What do you call that noise?
Was ihr oft gesungen habt in letzter Zeit.
One song you've sung many times is Battery Brides.
Magst du mal erzählen, was für dich so speziell war?
Would you like to say what makes this song so special to you?
Well,
Ich finde ihn halt schön langsam und der hat ein schönes langes
I like
Vorspiel.
that it's a slow song with a nice and long intro, and
Esther kann sich den Text.
She can memorize the lyrics of this one.
Okay.
Der ist nicht so
It's
kompliziert.
not too complicated.
Fällt mir wieder ein.
And what comes to my mind, you were often hopping around singing Helicopter.
Das ist einfach fröhlich und
yeah, that one is so happy and funny and wild,
wild. Halt wie
just like
halt
XTC.
ziemlich fröhlich.
Yes, really
Aber wenn man
happy.
ein bisschen was
But if you want something quieter,
mag ich Sacrificial Bonfire.
I like
auch sehr.
Sacrificial Bonfire
Ich finde
very much.
den finde ich toll. Da kann man sich schön
That one is
entspannen
great, and you can relax and reflect on things.
This World Over ist auch
This
ein
World
sehr
Over is also a very
Song.
beautiful song,
schöne Musik und hat einen sehr
slow
kritischen
and very
Text.
beautiful music with discerning lyrics.
What do you call that noise?
Okay, well, thanks for that. So let's start the chat then, fellas. I think we'll start with Mark, as it's all your fault that this is all happening. As I said in introduction, you started the official fan club fanzine Limelight in the early 80s. How did that come about? What's the story of that?
Well, first of all, I feel touched and honoured to be invited to be on the XTC podcast. It's very good of you to invite me. Thank you. Yeah, it was just the sort of schoolboy fantasy that probably a million people have, where you think, oh, wouldn't it be great to write a fanzine about our favourite band? And then, and one way or another, it's happened. Me and my friend Paul Badger, we sort of abstractly liked the idea of creating a fanzine about something. And it was coinciding with the two of us getting into XTC. I got Drums and Wires Christmas 1979, and we'd heard Making Plans for Nigel before that. And I'd been reading lots of good stuff about them. So it was more, I sort of read about them before I heard about them. And so we were really excited about this band, and we thought, wouldn't it be great to make a fanzine about XTC? And of course, being young and very, very naive, we didn't really have the barest idea of how you go about making a fanzine, or more to the point, how you even get in touch with the band. And so we very naively went off to the local library, or in fact the central library in Liverpool, which is about 10 miles away from where we lived on the Wirral, and went through all of the Swindon phone directories, which published all the names of those of us who can remember phone directories, and went through and found every A. Partridge and C. Moulding and T. Chambers, and of course they were all ex-directory, and so none of those letters got to the right place. But one letter did get to the right place, and that was the one, if I'm remembering correctly, the one to I think it was the one to D. Gregory ended up going to another D. Gregory, who happened to know Andy Partridge's mum, because Swindon is a small place, and she handed it over in the hairdressers. And then the letter ended up with Dave Gregory, and the next thing Dave Gregory was writing and saying, "Oh, this sounds quite an interesting idea. We haven't got we've had some trouble with our existing fan club, or we've never been quite satisfied with how things have gone. Maybe we could look into it." And then I seem to remember having Ian Reid, their manager, on the phone, and we got in touch with because fanzines were very big in this point, in whatever it was, the early 1980s, and there was a fanzine in Liverpool, and we got in touch with the editor there and said, "Oh, how do you do this?" And he said, "Oh, well, there are these typesetters, and there are this is a printer I can recommend." And so one step at a time, and the next thing, we produced issue 1 of Limelight in 1982 to perfectly coincide with XTC no longer touring, which meant that the thousands and thousands of copies I imagined we'd sell took a bit longer to sell than they might have done otherwise.
Because I think that's where I first came across Limelight. It was credited in Mummer, wasn't it?
That's it was, yeah.
Because I seem to remember writing to you anyway at that point when.
Yeah, and I can certainly remember having that sort of odd feeling as though everybody being in a record shop and picking up an XTC record and suddenly noticing my own name and address and thinking, "Oh, everyone must be looking at me," but of course they weren't. But suddenly feeling very self-conscious.
Excellent. Well, just a quick round robin to find out how Todd and Chris got involved in writing about the band as well. Chris, you wrote. Well, you're a music writer generally, but Chalkhills and Children was what's known as the definitive biography of the band. How did that come about? I mean, obviously, were you a fan from teenage years as well?
Yeah, I mean, quite similar to Mark's story. I was a fan, a bit of a groupie, if you like. XTC were the first band I ever saw live. In a place that you'll know, Kevin, a place called Barnstable Checkers. Maybe it closed by the time you...
Oh, absolutely.
Do you remember it? Yeah.
No, I remember going there several times, but I never saw them there.
That was about February 78. So they were the first band I ever saw live. And they blew me away literally because I was only 17 at the time, and I didn't really know what to expect from a live gig. I mean, it was kind of extraordinary that I was even allowed in. And the volume kind of, whoa! I thought, whoa! I mean, the gig was extraordinary on several levels.
It wasn't a huge club, was it?
No, but it probably had a capacity of about 500, and it was probably mostly filled. The only disappointment from my point of view was that my dad, who dropped me and my friend Paul Carpenter off, we'd agreed that he had to pick me up outside at midnight, and they only came on at 11:30. So I got to see half an hour of them. But in the meantime, as I said, I was literally blown away by the volume and intensity of the performance. But I'll never forget it because it was just an extraordinary gig. There was a young woman dancing next to me topless all the way through. So it was memorable for many reasons, right?
How very un-XTC.
Yeah.
Mind you, it's very North Devon.
Yeah. So anyway, I became a fan, not a massive fan at that time, but gradually over time, bizarrely, I became a much bigger fan when they stopped touring, because there was something I liked about the kind of insular world they suddenly entered with Mama and Big Express. And that also gave me the confidence, bizarrely, when they stopped being kind of, they weren't megastars, but, when they stopped being a kind of big presence on the stage and kind of went into their own world, I thought, well, I had enough confidence to approach them and say, is it okay if I write something about you? But at first they rejected me. In fact, they rejected me a couple of times. But I persevered, and that was the name of the game at the time.
Great. Well, we can go back into more details on that. But let's get around to Todd's first encounter. I mean, Todd, you're joining us from LA or near LA today, and from what I gather, you came to XTC in the kind of early mid '80s period, skylarking kind of time.
Yeah. Well,
So I mean, when did you first hear that, and how did such a peculiarly English band have such an impact in America at that point?
Well, actually, I came to them before skylarking, but with impeccable good timing. I discovered them right after they stopped touring. So I am jealous of all of you who have seen XTC live. And first thing, I should also say that I'm going to be a fanboy and say hello to both Chris and Mark, because I was fans of both of their work, and especially Chalkhills and Children. It was the first real inside glimpse I got of the band and their background and everything. But I discovered the band after having graduated university and moving in with a few folks who had some albums. One of them was not a fan of me sleeping as late as I did and partying as late into the night as I had the night before, and so would often wake me up with No Thugs in Our House at top volume. But then that got me instantly falling in love with English Settlement, because back when albums had sides, when you look at side 2 of English Settlement, and those 3 songs, No Thugs in Our House, Yacht Dance, Into, All of a Sudden, and then you realize they're all written by the same guy. I had to find out more about who this guy was. I started digging into their back catalog, and you were mentioning Mumber before. That was the first album that I bought new, and was actually quite afraid when I listened to the end of Funk Papa Roll and I heard Andy yelling "bye bye." I thought that was it, because I knew Terry had quit the band, and but then luckily they kept on and moved into broadened their palette considerably, moved into more and more different types of music with a broader spectrum of instrumentation and deeper songwriting and lyrics and everything else. And I've just loved every album even more as it's been released. And I had a chance to meet Andy back in 1998 when he had come to New York to shop what were the demos of what would become Apple Venus around to record companies in the city. I'd gotten to know David Yazbek because at that point, instead of being a world famous Tony Award winning songwriter for Broadway musicals, he was touring with this little pop band in little clubs. And I knew that he had worked with Andy on The Laughing Man, his first studio album, Yazbek's first studio album. And so David told me that Andy was going to be at a show that he was giving, that Yazbek was giving in New York. And he said, hey, why don't you come on up and I'll introduce you to him. And so having done some freelance writing, I had written some articles for Modern Drummer magazine. And because I knew they had a column in the magazine that was written by or for non-drummers called A Different View, and knowing that Andy had worked with a wide variety of drummers since Terry had left the band, I pitched the idea of interviewing Andy to the editors at the magazine. They said, sure, go for it. So when I did get a chance to meet Andy, I was able to be more than just another nose-picking fan saying, hey, I really like your work. I was able to say, hey, I'm a writer. Would you like to talk? My good pal, Mitch Friedman, who was a mutual friend, passed along Andy's contact information to me. And then we started talking from that point on. But the reason I bring up my daughter, who is 22 today, is because before I went on my road trip up to New York at that point, my wife and I, my wife at the time and I had a little fare thee well. And we looked back and realized that that was the day that she was conceived. So she was conceived on the day I met Andy and born on Andy's birthday. And I'm quite proud of myself that I did not name her Andrea.
Yeah. I could throw in your very own pink thing.
Oh.
Or I could, I suppose.
But yes. No, but I wasn't it about his child as but anyway. So I mean, obviously, so you've all worked personally with members of the band. I mean, obviously, Todd, your book was a compilation in conjunction with Andy about talking about each of the songs. Chris, a lot of the biography you wrote was distilled from various articles as well. But also, how much kind of personal involvement did the band have in compiling it with you? And did you have special input from them for it?
I had total cooperation and over several months. In fact, I was totally immersed in their world for probably about 8 months in all. First, they drew up the list of the people they thought I should interview, and it was a really intense period because luckily for me, I didn't have a proper job at the time, so I was traveling all over the country. They were recording non-such, or well, when I first met them, they were thinking about recording it, and then they went off to Chipping Norton to do it, which took. And so I was there for the whole period, and I was. It seemed to me that I was zigzagging the country all the time for about 8 months, speaking to people, either them or people that knew them, because it was 1991, wasn't it, when I was researching it and writing it. So still a lot of the people from their old days were still available. But God, I spent hundreds of hours with the band. And, they were very generous with their time, I have to say, very generous. I went to their homes and met with their families. It's just extraordinary, the access I got. The only thing that I regret is that I couldn't use all the resources that I was given because I was constrained by the publishers, really.
And it's interesting you're saying about the kind of really open access that you were given, because I read somewhere that you've also done a biography with the Stranglers, and they were the complete opposite. They were very much more pravda about it all. They only wanted certain things to be aired, but from understand, Andy was very open about certain elements, talking about his breakdown and affairs and with Colin, or with Colin's affair. So it seemed a completely different, contrasting style in those between those two books.
Oh, totally. I mean, this is why I was absolutely delighted to get the XTC gig, because as much as I loved and still do actually love the Stranglers, they were very difficult. They were basically 4 people who didn't really like each other that much, and also had very, very certain ideas about what I could and couldn't say. So it was kind of going from a kind of Maoist environment to, just say whatever you like. And I remember the very first interview I did with Andy in his home. I couldn't believe how open and honest he was, because with the Stranglers, and there will be Stranglers, because I know the quite a lot of Stranglers fans are also XTC fans, might end up listening to this. With the Stranglers, it was very much a case of, you can say this, but you can't say that. From day one of meeting Andy, it was like, say what the fuck you like. I thought, well, this is great. I will then.
And it strikes me that what I think for all three of us, it seems to me that we're in a very privileged situation that Andy in particular, but actually all of the members in general are open, as Chris says, but also just very articulate. And when I read other people's autobiographies and biographies of other, this similar sort of ilk, they can be, reasonably well written, sometimes a little bit tedious or whatever. But on the whole, it's much more pedestrian, much more mundane than XTC. And it seems to me that the reason why I can still keep on doing this is that it seems to be like there's an endless source of material that you can keep on mining and mining and mining, because there is still more to be said. But the stuff that has been said is really interesting. And I think Todd's book is a perfect example of that, because Andy talks unusually interestingly about it and perceptively about his own material, I think, in a way that you often hear other artists talking about their stuff, and they'll just say things like, "Oh, I'm not very good at talking about this," and you think, well, yeah, it's maybe not a surprise about the other artists, but a real surprise how generous and interesting they can be.
Yeah, Andy is a dream interview. And the other guys are great too, but he's so funny. And the big challenge, of course, is just keeping up with him, because you can end up 3 or 4 miles away from your original question in a matter of a minute if you're not careful, which can be a lot of fun. But then, if you have a specific, agenda that you want to try to stick to, or a list of questions, you got to work your way back there.
Yeah, and also the other thing you have to keep up with is his jokes. Because for as long as I've been interviewing him, I've been transcribing the tapes afterwards, and then realizing that there was a fantastic joke that I just missed that would be like a joke within a joke or something, and it just sort of goes straight over your head, and you think, oh yes, he was making a joke there.
Well, and Mark, go back to you. That openness was quite apparent when you started Limelight, really, wasn't it? Because didn't Ian Reid actually give you some money and help fund the whole project, the manager at the time?
Yeah, he effectively, we sent the bill. I suppose, I don't know if money came directly to us, but I think we would just forward the bill from the printer, which would have been the biggest cost for the first, I can't remember, 3 or 4 issues, until there was enough money, and we were selling them for like a very small amount of money, 50 pence a time or something. And people would be, it's just weird to think back about how you used to have to do a fanzine back in the day. I don't know. I think Chris was involved in. It's called the Stranglers magazine.
Certainly.
But it was very. What now seems very clunky, that somebody would have to send a stamped address letter to me, and I would then send out an order form to them, and then they would fill in the order form and send it back with a postal order or a check, and then I would have to go to the post office with all these international reply coupons, which could be exchanged for stamps and so on. It was just a very archaic and slow process, but eventually enough money came in that meant that we could pay the next printer's bill after issue 5 or something like that. And so, but yeah, they basically saw an opportunity to communicate with the fans via 2 of us who were willing enough to put in that donkey work for them and be the voice, their voice to the fans, and the fans' voice back to them, I suppose. Yeah. But certainly that generosity, it was. They saw the value of it. So in a way, I do remember thinking at the time that we went a real fanzine, in the sense that we were not having to scrabble together to get the money and go down to photocopiers and stuff. We could do it reasonably properly without because we were official in that sense.
So fast forward a few years then, Mark, and you put together the Bumper Book of Fun for Boys and Girls, which was a compilation of the Limelight fanzines. How did that come about then? And what kind of help did you get from the band for that? Was there something in the zeitgeist?
Well, yes, without me realizing it. I think the zeitgeist is interesting. If you look now around the people who are listening to this podcast, who've I've got two books now. That there's that one, and what do you call that noise? And I think a whole generation of us have arrived at the age we have, and we can look back, and we are talking about not even 30 years, we're talking about 40 years, maybe getting on for 50 years in some cases, people looking back at their lives and remembering in a nostalgic way, but I think also quite an intelligent and interesting way about what this music means in 2021. And so there is a zeitgeisty thing going on, and the way the Bumper Book of Fun came about was just sort of saying yes to things. My daughter was working at the Stand Comedy Club and overheard Stuart Lee and Joanna Neary, both of whom were in the recent XTC podcast involving the comedians, and they were performing on the Edinburgh Fringe, and she was working in the Stand Comedy Club and overheard the two of them talking about XTC. So she naturally went up and said, "My dad used to do the XTC fanzine," and they said, "Oh wow, we'd love to see these things." And so she came back and told me, and I thought, "Oh, how privileged! Yeah, Stuart Lee wants to see my fanzines." And the thing is, I only really had my own copies. I'd sold out of every edition apart from my own copies, and I said, "Well, I can show you them to them, but I haven't really got anything to give them." And she said, "Well, I could scan them," and that just led to the thought process was then, well, if all these things are scanned, then they don't just have to be seen by two comedians, they could be seen by lots of people. And so I thought, well, I wonder if I could put these together as a compilation, and then I could get other articles around it, and so and just relive all of those days. And so the Bumper Book of Fun is this, I think, quite an interesting combination of the new and the old. So there's these sort of glossy pages with new material, including interviews with the band and so on, alongside the old hand-printed, letter set and mad typefaced black and white original publications, and then because of Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it, it was possible to get quite quickly access to a group of dedicated fans who would be the market for this book. And yes, I mean, it's the same thing that we've just been talking about. The band were very happy to contribute. I'm pretty sure that I did the very, very first TC&I interview because Colin and Terry were, and this is a zeitgeist thing as well, they just happened to have come together, and Terry happened to be back in the UK just as I was having this idea, and so they were building up at the time. I think there is, if I remember, there's an inaccuracy in the set listing, the track listing that I give, because they still hadn't quite finalized the final songs that would go on that initial EP, which actually, now I think about it, is true to the spirit of Limelight in general, because the news pages were always just me on the phone to Andy Partridge, desperately trying to scribble down what he was telling me and mishearing the titles of songs, and you would just have these interesting sounding things, and you would mishear them and write them down, and then other things wouldn't be released and so on. And so the level of inaccuracy in Limelight was sort of, I think now, sort of charmingly dubious. But yeah, so the Bumper Book of Fun emerged and re-entered the world with new material and with the full support of the band, who, as ever, were as interesting and articulate and enthusiastic as ever.
And Chris, you did wasn't there a revised edition of Chalkhills as well in 2002, 2003? And because there seemed to be a kind of revival or a reappreciation of that whole post-punk art rock thing in the early noughties, wasn't there? There's a lot of bands that were citing all those post-punk bands, Franz Ferdinand and the Future Heads and what have you. Was that all, once again, was that a zeitgeisty thing? Was it just market demand? More people wanted more XTC products?
Well, it was both, because I mean, the interesting part of the story here is that the reason I became the first writer to write about XTC in book form is because I was kind of like the cut price author, I was available. I was very keen. I wanted to do it. I was banging on their doors. I think if it had been 10 years later, there would have been 10 other more able writers in front of me, to be honest. So what happened was I did this book for Omnibus Press. It almost didn't get published even at the last minute because apparently the managing director person of on Omnibus Music Sales, as the company is called, said, "Hang on, why were we about to publish a book about XTC? Nobody's ever heard of them." And it was just because of pretty much there was a lovely guy called Andrew King who worked in the company who said, "No, I think it'll work." So he persuaded the guy to go through with it, and actually it sold bloody well. I can't put precise figures on it, but I've been told it sold between 30 and 40,000, right? That's pretty bloody good. If you think about around the era of Mama and Big Express, they were selling around the region of 50,000 albums. I think it really shook them. And and that's how the Japanese edition came about, the brilliant Japanese version. And then suddenly out of the blue, a few years later, they rang me up and said, "Yeah, can you update it?" And I thought, well, okay, yeah. And then, yes, you're right. It was a very intense few months and I updated it. And bizarrely, the publication of the second version came out pretty much when they stopped, right? Because Wasp Star had just come out. And I think I'm flicking on the last page. At the time, it was predicted they were going to release an album every 6 months, and then bang, that was it. I couldn't have predicted it, and I wouldn't have wanted to, but that's the way it worked out.
I only relatively discovered that there was an update. I've got the original version, but I didn't know, or I'd forgotten, or I don't know. But and now when you try and buy it, it's like hen's teeth. It goes for stupid amounts of money online. If you it's like 80 quid or something.
But yeah, friends have told me they're finding it very hard to track down these days. That's good.
I'm glad I saved my original edition then.
First edition, yeah, they're always worth more. But yeah,
it'll be worth a fortune if you give it 20 years.
It is interesting that the band has had such an influence on other bands, as I say, that kind of new generation. And one that I'm always thinking about that never seems to get talked about much is the kind of Blur connection. You know, that whole English pop, Brit pop thing. Because I know Andy Partridge produced demos for Modern Life is Rubbish, which was immediately ditched and not used at all. But Graham Coxon has cited Andy Partridge and XTC as a hush, don't, yeah, it was XTC. But they always kind of talk more loudly about more kind of cooler influences, and I think that's very strange and very odd. It's like, you know, the band that dare not speak its name. Todd, for example, what kind of...
Well, I talk a lot about the fact that they are the quintessential musicians band. The joke with me is whenever I mention, and it's not a joke because it's real, whenever I mentioned XTC to anyone and they know who they are, my next question is, really, what instrument do you play? And 9 times out of 10, they play an instrument.
Yeah.
And if in that one instance where they don't, they were really into music or are really into music. And so they know about this special band. And I think it has a lot to do with the just absolute, wild-eyed commitment of XTC's core base of fans, because we feel that they're the little engine that could, and they got beaten down along the way and never got the credit they were due. They stopped touring, so there's the allure around that. They went through all the bullshit that too many musicians have gone through with record label problems and manager problems and everything else. And it's not like Andy is living in a palatial mansion somewhere in the English countryside. He is still living in his very modest house in Swindon, and they're but at the same time, they have this incredible catalog that any musician would be proud of. And I think a lot of it has to do too with just the fact that it is one of the reasons I didn't see XTC when they played live is because I was into progressive rock and that was my thing. And I wasn't really plugged in so much into the punk and new wave scene at the time, even though they played right near me in university. And I could have had the opportunity to see them. But then I've also noticed that there's a big crossover between, Chris was saying there are a lot of Stranglers fans who are XTC fans. There are a lot of progressive rock fans who are XTC fans because they realize the depth and complexity of what is actually in the music. Even though these are typically short pop songs that follow more or less the Abacab structure, there's always something there. It's multi-layered. The lyrics are genius. There are so many, the guitar parts, the way Dave and Andy combine, and the brilliance of Collins playing, and the fact that he provides such an incredible foil to Andy, being the McCartney to Andy's Lennon and all that. And then besides Terry and his incredible straightforward style that was so appropriate for the early albums, the fact that they were then able to branch out and use all these other different drummers, there's just so much to listen to. Now when I listen to albums, I still hear new things. So
yeah,
that's my little rant about.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is how consistent the reaction to the band has been. And if you look back at the early issues of Limelight, I think from memory it's issue 2, the sort of editorial at the start. The first line is something like, "We are not alone," because suddenly we had all these fans writing to us. But even effectively at the height of the band's popularity, it still felt like they were a bit of a sort of best kept secret among those people who knew, and that just remains the case. And I think possibly one thing that has changed is that because history now exists and there's 40 or 50 years of this stuff, that the business about whether they're fashionable or not fashionable has ceased to be relevant. And so the recent podcast we did with the fans who are in their 20s, I don't think they have any they're not looking for the cool thing. It's just this interesting music that they found from that happens to be from the past, and they don't have any sort of extra opinion. They don't have the NME telling them this, they're allowed to like this band or they're not allowed to like this band. They can just hear the music and go for it. So I think possibly that has changed, but still, you often see people on Twitter saying what I would say, which is that they feel like somehow they've projected this image that they're your band and that nobody else knows about them, and you almost get a little bit defensive if they for some reason get a bit popular, because you think, no, they're mine, they're mine, they're mine. Don't steal them away from me. But that's always been true of their work, and I like it, but I don't really know why it should be.
And if you're a fan of a particular genre, XTC's catalog covers a lot of ground. I mean, you look at the range from white music to Wasp Star and Apple Venus. I mean, come on, they just pick. There's something there for you.
Yeah. I know. If somebody asks for a recommendation, I've always got to ask them, well, what sort of music do you like?
Exactly.
To fight. Well, if you like punky stuff, well, maybe you'll like this, and if you like proggy stuff, maybe you'll like this. Or what's your mood today?
Well, I mean, when white music came out, I literally just started to learn to play the guitar. I haven't written about them in the same way as you guys have, but I've written songs blatantly ripping them off, and my old school band used to do a lot of covers, but I did follow them on that musical development and journey. I mean, I loved the kind of pop art spikiness of white music and Go To, but then then also got on to the Drums and Wires was a big one for me. Well, the whole mid-period, and I confess to losing them a little bit at Skylarking, because I rediscovered what I'd liked about them in the then emerging kind of C86 music, which was kind of a 60s jangly and that kind of thing. But from them, I did, go branch out into sort of avant-garde, Philip Glass, and discovered a whole lot of different things from them as well. Free jazz, because I know Andy Partridge liked a lot of his improv free jazz. So, they were an education, not just a band.
And I think I do. For me, it was. I was just obviously the right age at the right time and getting into the right band. So many coincidences, really. I could have got into. Well, Chris has mentioned the Stranglers. There's lots of other people that you could have got into just with a very small difference in the way things panned out. But I feel very, very, very fortunate to have got into this particular band purely from a journalistic sense, in that there was always something interesting to write about, whether it was them dressing up as the Dukes of Stratosphere, or the influence they've had on other people, or all the influences that you're talking about, Kevin, whether you could go into these different directions. And so every new album sounded different to the last. So there was, you could talk about the different instrumentations and the things that they were being influenced by and so on. So in addition to the fact that they are very articulate about talking about it, they were always doing something interesting. And there are lots of bands who, I would say that I like, but I don't think I would be particularly interested in writing about them, because the story doesn't change. But with XTC, the story always does change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Stephen Wilson makes a point of talking about the growth between different albums. And, Andy likes to joke about how failure was very good to them. And so it comes back to us, them being our own little secret, but it was good for them too, because it kept them really trying and striving and working. And I think it also kept the band together, because, I'm sure you guys have seen how hard it can be with personal dynamics and everything. And being in a band is very much being in a relationship. You know how hard it can be to keep a relationship together, especially when it's a poly relationship, which is what a band is. And so, but they were, mates that held together. It was them against the world, or against the record company, or whatever. And, they just kept trying and trying and trying, and making albums that were each different and arguably better than the last.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously I was too young to go through the Beatles and appreciate what they did in terms of progression. Or even though I'm delighted to have become a Beatles fan in the last few years, but XTC were kind of my Beatles in a way, because the progression album to album was thrilling, and it happened very, very quickly. The only time I started to fear for them was around the time of Mama, when they stopped touring, and the work became more intense, more introspective. And I remember thinking when I first heard Big Express, I love this, but I can't see how a big record company are going to stick with them for much longer, because it's so difficult for my mate even to understand, but somehow,
that's why Todd Rundgren saved their career.
Yeah.
And also, when Big Express came out, when was that, 84 or so, the things happening in the indie pop world were shifting then anyway, weren't they? I mean, it's the Smiths, and as I say, it was the whole C86 jangly guitar, thing that was going on, more DIY, more back to basics. So the kind of bigger production that they were going along with then probably weren't making them cool for that kind of audience at that point either.
No, and then it was just a series of lucky incidents, wasn't it? The Dukes, which then came on to Skylarking, which, when I remember I was on the Virgin press list, and I got a cassette pre-release of that. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, wow, okay, they're back, Yeah. It wasn't just, all my kind of fears about my second favorite band, sorry, first to second, were kind of resolved in one go, But I mean, kind of, I know, because I kind of catalogued part of this in my book. Yeah, I think good on Virgin for sticking with them as long as they did, because they couldn't have been an easy sell, especially after English Settlement.
Although you got to wonder if they ever really lost money on them. I don't think they probably did.
No.
As much as they gave the band shit and put pressure on them, where's the single? Where's the single? And you got to use an American producer, et cetera, et cetera.
That's true.
But, they were not doing what every other band was doing at the time, of course. So they weren't making them as much money by any means, I'm sure.
I mean, that's true. Virgin were never that stupid. So there were, but I think it was always a tight margins, put it like that.
Yeah, no doubt.
And I got the impression that certainly in the early days, there were a lot of big fans within Virgin who would support,
Yes,
who were behind them, who liked them, who wanted them to do well. They were like a pet band.
Yeah, and I think that had a lot to do with their personalities. To go back to the Stranglers again, lots of record companies got rid of them because they were just too difficult. I can't imagine that anyone would have had difficulty dealing with Andy, Colin, and co. and Dave. They were always charming. They were described to me by somebody at Virgin as sweethearts, which is a bit patronising, but I can see where they were coming from.
Yeah. And although a lot of fans talk about how sad it was that they split up, they actually were together a tremendous amount of time. Way longer than any band would normally be. A lifespan of many bands is 3 years or something, and for them there must have been a way of working and a level of compromise and understanding and enjoying each other's company that made them last as long as they did, because it's not
and
easy.
all those guys still love each other. You can tell it when you speak to all of them.
Absolutely,
individually. They all have, even if they have differences over how the business is run now or whatever, they have a huge amount of respect for each other as people and as creative musicians.
Yeah, you never hear them saying a bad word about each other's musicianship.
No, never. But for all the people out there wondering, they're not getting back together. We should put the kibosh on that, just in case anybody's wondering. It's not going to happen. Stop asking.
I had a friend say to me today when he heard I was chatting to you guys, "Oh, get them to influence and get the band back together, a couple of gigs." I said, "It's not going to happen. So not going to happen."
See, I knew that was coming.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was interesting. Did anybody get to see TC and I a couple of years ago? Oh, you did, Mark. You said
yes. I spent the week. I didn't see that they did. Was it? How many altogether? Was it 6 altogether? Or 8? I can't remember. But I did the full week when they did Monday till Thursday or something. So I did 4, I suppose. Yeah, and it was amazing. Yeah, and actually,
that's probably the closest we're ever going to get.
It is, and Terry's. I'm with all due respect to Todd, I don't tend to notice drummers, but I always notice Terry. So in that sense, Terry is my favorite drummer, or him and Ringo, I suppose. You hear, you notice them on the records, and so to have Terry Chambers playing those songs and I suppose by focusing on Colin's songs, you got a particular take on the catalogue. But it's what an amazing catalogue, and they did such a good job at it, and staying there for a week, and you could sort of watch them relax into it, and come out first of all sort of a bit rabbit in the headlights, but just as the days went on, thinking, oh, this is all right, people like us, it sounds good, and so on, and so and all the camaraderie of the other fans around the town. I kept on bumping into people in hotels and bars and so on. So it was a tremendous chance to see, and yet at the same time, and I'm hoping that Terry Chambers we all get through the coronavirus crisis, and Terry Chambers manages to get XTC out on the road again, because I nearly saw him at the Queen's Hall here in Edinburgh, and that was cancelled. But I'm tremendously excited to see that, and yet at the same time, I'm not particularly bothered about XTC getting together. It feels like they've got a legacy of work. Yeah. They've got they're happy with that. There's more than enough there that to keep anyone happy with. So I don't have a desire to see. And I did see, of course, I'm privileged. I saw XTC live when I was a lot younger twice, and so it doesn't feel like I've got that particular desire. Of course, I'd go if they did, but I don't have that need that other people do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I kept my streak going. I missed it because I'm an idiot, and I thought they were going to stick together for a little while, so I'd have another chance. So my mistake.
Yeah. I thought there was going to be a second tour, so I held back, and well, we regret it now, because I know loads of people who went to those gigs and loved it, absolutely loved it.
Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, I know. When I saw them in Oxford, Chris, that was like a a trip up from Oakhampton School. We bunked off school a little bit early, I think on the Thursday, and me and James Mayers and a couple of other mates, we drove up to Oxford and got back in time for first class at 10 o'clock in the morning. That's dedication. Devon to back.
Well done. I've done similar with other bands.
I forget who was supporting them. I had this. I've been living with this fantasy that it was a band called Comsat Angels supporting them, but I've been told recently it wasn't. It was a band called 003 Minutes. Who? I wish it had been Comsat Angels though, who are very, once again, kind of contemporaries of them and very similar, that kind of nerdy, slightly muso-y, but that kind of, as I say, spiky, energetic art rock kind of thing going on as well, weren't they?
Heard of the Comsat Angels? Afraid 000 music.
I think a lot of people who are into that early XTC first 2, 3, 4 albums were probably Comsat Angel fans as well. But just going back to the writing and having met most of the band members, going back to the old adage, you never meet your heroes. Were there ever occasions when that occurred to you? Did things ever get awkward, or did people not come across as quite the way you imagined or wanted them to be? Todd, how was working with Andy on putting together all the information about the songs?
Well, the process with him was just fantastic. I got lucky to meet him that first time, write the article for Modern Drummer. So I think it helped for him to see that I was legit. I wasn't just making something up. I made a point of trying to stay in touch with them. And then when Wasp Star came out, I think, I got in touch with the magazine again and was able to do a short article on Chuck Sabo. And also, I was able to follow up with Terry because at that point, Kai was he was just coming into his own as a drummer and was recording in Australia. Terry's son, Kai. So I also started, kept talking to Andy. At that point, the internet was turning into a thing. They were still in the strike. Their kind of marketing stride had been broken. And during the day, this is what I do for a living. I do communications and marketing and things like that. So I was trying to talk to him and help them and give him some information about how the internet worked and the possibilities for that. And then MySpace started up. A friend of mine, Rob Cosentino, started a MySpace site for XTC, but then pulled me into it. And then I was trying to figure out how do we keep people coming in? How do we keep them coming back week after week? So then we would post new songs. And then I had done an interview with Andy for a book on lyric writing. And I had to leave so much of that great interview on the cutting room floor that we decided, because MySpace had a blog feature, I put it up there as a blog, got great feedback from people, and then decided I realized, talking to Andy, who at that point was quite frustrated by song stories and the amount of material they hadn't been able to use there. And so, Chris, I feel your pain because I'm sure you had so much stuff that wasn't able to make it into a book, because a book is by its nature limited with the amount of, print you can print on a page. You can't put out a 800-page or multi-volume set. So, but with the internet, of course, we were just burning pixels. So Andy and I started the whole series of talking every couple weeks or every week about a song that he was doing and going into it in real depth. It was his chance to not lose that material and to correct any misapprehensions that might be out there. And, as we talked and talked more and more, we just became closer and closer friends. We'd talk about a million things that had nothing to do with music. I got to know the other band members over time. All of them are just lovely, generous people. It's just both what Mark and Chris have been saying about their interactions with them. And it's, I've never had anything but good experiences with them. So.
Yeah, I'd say my feeling is, I think it's my psychology, being quite very young when we started the fanzine and thinking, well, I don't want to be seen to be the overeager fan who's calling them up every minute, and so I've always been sort of protective of them, if you like. And so I thought, well, I shouldn't, I'm not really their friends, but I am, I've got this sort of fan relationship with them. So, but whenever I have approached them, they've always been open and generous and human, I suppose. They don't have any airs and graces about them. They're into doing their job. They're probably one reason why they didn't get ultra famous is because their hunger for that sort of fame was not really great. What their hunger was for creating fantastic music.
Right.
Yeah. Kevin, to get back to your question, there was absolutely no disappointment whatsoever in meeting and working with them. It was the complete opposite, because by the time I had got into their world, I'd got used to working. I'd worked with a number of bands actually, but I was on a Record Mirror, which is long defunct. So I'd meet rock stars quite regularly, and they could be interesting, but they could also be arseholes. So for me to meet the band that I love the most, for them to be as charming and funny and engaging as I knew they would be, was just a thrill. The only thing that tarnished my experience of working with them was the sense of disappointment that I gave them, because I was on a tight gig. I was commissioned to write this thing. I was given 6 months to turn it round, and so I had kind of three conflicting things going on. I had to satisfy the publisher, who wanted a certain thing delivered in a certain time. I had the band quite rightly saying, but maybe you could say more about this, more about this, more about this. And then I had my own I was also putting pressure on myself. So it became kind of, towards the end of writing that book, it became quite stressful, because I couldn't really satisfy those three parties. It was going to be impossible. I kind of did the best I could, and I think it's okay, but it's not a book I want to particularly reread. I think it's very factual. I think the band were quite right when they wanted more of this, that, and the other. They wanted more of that, but the thing is that under the gig, on the terms of the gig, I just couldn't do it the way I or them would really want to. So I'm proud of the fact that it turned out to be the first book about them. So that's a good thing.
And I'm going to disagree with you about the quality of the book. And believe me, I feel your pain. I've been in that position, and I know I got very lucky being able to start with something that was online and then pare things down and kind of work in the opposite way. But I thought it was a very engaging read. And like I said, as a fan, it was my first real, of course I'd read Limelight and the Little Express and the other fanzines and stuff, but this was the first biography, and it felt quite like a very meaty thing to sink my teeth into.
Oh, well, that's kind. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with
credit where credit's due.
I agree with Todd, and I'm also thinking about something that Chris mentioned earlier, which was that XTC were the first band that he saw live, and it was the same with me. That they were the first gig for me, and then of course you have no point of reference. And I remember getting really excited by the support band, whoever they were, and didn't come to anything else, but because I just hadn't seen anything like it, and it was loud and whatever,
right.
So but then with the benefit of hindsight, you realize, hold on, I actually started at the top here in terms of seeing bands live. They really were, and it takes a long time to get that perspective, but in addition to that, I also started at the top because it must be the case that Andy Partridge was the first person I ever interviewed, and subsequently I am a journalist. I'm a professional journalist. So like Chris and all the rock stars that you were interviewing for the Record Mirror, I've interviewed many people over the years, specializing in theatre. I haven't done that much music, but met loads and loads of really interesting and articulate people. But I still say that I started at the top with talking to XTC because there are not many people that you can go back to time and time and time again, and they will always have a new take, a new perspective, and a fresh. Either they're doing something new, or they'll have a fresh take on something old. And as again, I said it earlier, as a journalist, that's a gift. It really is a gift.
Yeah, you never walk away disappointed after talking with any of them.
I have seen them live, but I've never met them in quite the same way as you guys have. So it's, that's a fair swap, I think, isn't it? Because I'm sure if I was ever to have met Andy Partridge at the time, I would have just fainted, because I realise now there's so many mannerisms. It's really strange how a person in your formative years can have such an impact on you and you don't realise it until many years later. But I realise now I've got so many kind of mannerisms and music influences and things that all goes back to Swindon, which is very bizarre. Yeah, I know this isn't going to work on the podcast, but I have a black and red squared jumper here, which was knitted by my neighbour, Mrs. Hockin, which is obviously I nicked from the back cover of White Music, because Andy Partridge was wearing a black and red squared jumper. So, stuff like that.
I've just had a flashback to I don't know how many years ago, and I hadn't been in touch with the band for quite a long time, and it was January, and I decided to have an alcohol-free January. So I was having a dry January, and it was the last day of January, which is our wedding anniversary, and I'd opened my first drink in a month, and I took a drink from it, and the phone rang, and it was Andy Partridge, and I thought, wow, this wine's good.
I've got to do this more often. Yeah.
So any more future plans for writing? I mean, Mark, are you? The podcast has obviously come about as a consequence, a nice side effect of COVID, I believe. Do you see anything else written, maybe coming out of the podcast?
Well, I've mentioned the passage of time a few times in this podcast, and a couple of people have said to me, "Oh, how do you still have more stuff to say about this band who hasn't, they haven't even produced anything for 20 years?" And I think it makes me think of people who keep on writing books about World War II. There's still more to be said about it, because the world changes and your perspective changes on it, and you start hearing more things. So I don't feel that there's any limit to the amount of stuff that can be written, whether it's talking like this in podcast format, or I've got a couple of ideas for books that may or may not work out, and I think there's still there's not just a readership, there's interesting things to be said, and I don't think the full picture, for all the great work that Chris and Todd have done, there's still more to be said and more to be explored.
Yeah, and they do continue to write music, as we know.
Yeah.
Both TC and I, and the subsequent projects that they're working on. Dave's been quite busy with Big Train and a number of other bands, Tin Spirits, others. And Andy is hard at work, even though you've seen the collaborations that he's done with people like Robin Hitchcock and Peter and the other folks. But and then he and I have been talking about a couple different projects. We do want to do a second volume of the Complicated Game book, delving into some of the interviews and doing actually fresh stuff on some of the songs that we didn't include in the first volume, but also looking at songs that he plans to include in a project that he's tentatively titled My Failed Songwriting Career, where he has written, he spent a long time trying to write songs for other people, and mostly having them inexplicably rejected. But that's because they're Andy Partridge songs. He writes Andy Partridge songs. But luckily the Monkees were smart enough to pick up some of his songs. But I've heard some of the demos and they're amazing. So I can't wait for that to come out. And we want to talk about that and include some of that in there so that we have a little bit of synergy going between the book and his release.
Oh, that sounds great and potentially very funny.
There's some great stuff in there. Yeah.
Because the good thing Andy's brilliant at is being self-deprecating. so that could be fantastic.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you, Mark, for giving me the reins for this particular podcast. That was quite a surprise, very random, but I'm very delighted, obviously. If you'd have told a 15-year-old me that I'd be doing this 40-odd years ago. I'm sorry?
I said ably handled.
If you'd have told the 15-year-old, Well, thank you very much. I've been waiting all my life for this. No, it's been amazing. Thank you very much.
It's actually making me realize that what I've done all my life is true to the fanzine spirit, and the idea of the fanzine, for those too young to, of the internet generation to understand what the fanzines are all about. It was about the voice of the ordinary fans being expressed, and I've just sort of embrace that without even thinking about it to such an extent that, what do you call that noise, for example, is really it looks like a book, but it's a big fanzine. It's a big fanzine. Just looking a little posher, really. It's just lots of people's voices all coming together, and I think I like the idea of the podcast being lots of different voices coming together and expressing themselves. And if I can help people do that, then that seems to be my role in life for some reason.
It's the one big thing we all have in common, right? Our love of the band.
Exactly.
And it's been great fun reminiscing.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
What do you call that noise?
A big thanks from me to Kev Windsor for hosting this episode. That was really good of you, Kev. Thank you. Thanks too to Chris and Todd, and of course Arthur, Esther and Raina in Germany, and Polly, Hamish and Don in Scotland, as well as Jessica at Strangetown Theatre Company. If you'd like copies of the books, you'll probably have to search for a second-hand copy of Chalkhills and Children by Chris Twomey, because that's quite hard to get hold of. You can find Complicated Game by Todd Bernhardt and Andy Partridge at burningshed.com, where you can also find my two books, the XTC Bumper Book of Fun for Boys and Girls and What Do You Call That Noise, an XTC Discovery Book. Alternatively, you can get both of those two books at xtclimelight.com. Thanks as ever to the podcast supporters at Patreon, in particular to the following Knights in Shining Karma: Matt Anderson, Terry Arnott, Dan Barrow, Matt Bell, Kevin Burt, Liam Duggan, Jamie Dunn, Helen Fay, Robert Graham, Robert Lawlaw, Dennis LeCourrier, Liz Lynch, Amy Parkinson, Murray Meikle, Kevin Murray, Karen Neal, James Newell, Mark Reed, James Reimer, Simon Slateholm, Michael Sutcliffe, Mark Thomas, Nigel Waller, and William Wilkstrom. If you'd like to support the XTC podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Mark Fisher. See you again next time. Thanks for listening.
What do you call that noise?